I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. And today we're going to be talking about something that's really close to my heart, which is transforming your sewing space into a true creative sanctuary. So whether you're sewing in a dedicated room, in a corner of your living room, or even a closet like one of our creative seam workers that we're going to be talking about today, these tips will help you create a space that feels peaceful and nurturing and just perfect for fueling your creativity. It's easy to think that just having a tidy space is enough. And yes, I think being clutter-free does really work wonders for your mental clarity. But today, I want to encourage you to think a little bit bigger than that. So your sewing space isn't just a workspace, it's a creative workspace. And while you definitely have work to do while you're in it, it should be a space that actively contributes to your creativity, a special place that's just for you and your sewing, where you feel nurtured and comfortable and inspired. All right, let's get into the tips. So let's start with tip number 1, choosing soothing colors and decor. The colors around you when you sew can really have a huge impact on your mood and on your creativity. So if you have the space to paint, consider calming blues and greens, or even neutral tones like taupe or gray if you want to get that feeling of serenity. And if you want to add some energy into your space instead, you might want to incorporate some bright blues, some reds, or some yellows as accent colors. It really depends on the level of energy that you personally feel comfortable with when you sew. Some people want to feel serene when they're sewing. Some people want to feel more energetic. And finding the right balance for you is something that you can achieve just by bringing a little bit more color into your space. I know some sewists love an all-white space for its really clean and creative feel. It's sort of like a blank canvas for all the things that you're going to create. I personally really like that too. And if you don't have painting privileges in your space, it's no problem. You can bring in these colors through things like storage bins or shelving or small decorative items like ceramics or containers. I personally have a sewing space that's mostly white, but I've incorporated some kind of muddy pastel colors into it, which I personally really love. And I've also incorporated some light wood tones, a lot of natural textures. I have a lot of baskets in there, things like that, because I like those natural elements. And even some bright red I've started to bring in just to bring in a little bit more energy. I think it brings in a nice little pop of color that makes me feel a little bit more alive and awake when I come into the space. So I just got a little mini toolbox that's bright red. It's like the shiny little thing. It's very cute. And I'm trying to bring a little bit more of that into the space. So, which just kind of brings me to another point, which is that these things can evolve over time. So you can kind of pay attention to where your energy is at while you're sewing. Are you feeling more creative when you go into your space, or is there something that's missing, some kind of energy that's missing? And how could you bring that in through your surroundings, through your environment? By the way, if you want to see my sewing space, you can definitely head over to our YouTube channel, which is at Seamwork Video, and you can watch the recent tour I did of my sewing shed. So if you're not familiar with it already, I built a sewing shed in my backyard and I do all my sewing out there, and I've outfitted it just the way I want it. And I did a little update tour recently, and it's really, really fun to watch. So head on over to the YouTube channel if you want to see that. And I just love seeing how creative a lot of different sewists get with this. One of our seam workers actually put up a beautiful wallpaper panel inside her sewing closet to differentiate it from her bedroom. So she sews in a closet in her bedroom, and she wanted to delineate the two spaces, make the two spaces feel a little bit more separate. So she used wallpaper to do that, which I think is such a clever way to create a distinct creative space, even if it's in a really small area. So I think even if you don't have a lot of room, it's almost more important to create that delineation for yourself and to kind of rope it off as your creative area, even if it's just a corner. So that's tip number 1, is using color. Tip number 2 is all about comfort. And I think comfort is absolutely key. I cannot stress this enough, especially if you're someone who gets lost in long sewing sessions like I do personally. I can be in my shed sewing for hours and hours. I find it hard to stop once I get started sometimes. And so making sure that you're taking care of your body and taking care of yourself while you're sewing goes a really long way, not just for, your physicality, for your physical comfort, but for making sewing feel like something that you want to get back to, something that you want to do because it's not physically painful. So a supportive chair is probably the most important investment that you can make. Your back will definitely thank you later for having a supportive chair. I personally love having one with wheels. It makes it just so much easier to spin between my machine and my serger without constantly getting up and down. I have them both on one desk. So I have my machine right next to my serger, and then I have a spinning chair or a wheeled chair rather, that I can then move between them really, really easily. That both speeds up your sewing. That's a good tip for just speeding up your sewing, but at the same time, you can be really, really comfortable and just make your sewing area as functional as possible. And if you're like me and you spend a lot of time standing at your cutting table, a cushioned mat can be a real game changer for your feet. So I first started using these decades ago now when I had a job working in a warehouse and was standing at a table and packing orders and unpacking things all day long. And it really helps your legs and your lower back if you're doing a lot of standing to have one of these cushioned mats. They're pretty easy to find. You can find them on uline.com, for example. Those are made for warehouses. There's a lot of different options out there, and they're usually not very expensive. So that's one of the things that can be just really good for your body if you spend a lot of time standing. And don't forget the little comfort touches. So maybe a throw pillow, maybe a little soft rug under your feet, or even just a cozy blanket draped over the back of your chair. Those things can make your space feel so much more inviting. Those just little pieces of comfort that you can bring into your space and make it feel like someplace that you really want to be. For tip 3, let's talk about personalizing your sewing space. So this is where you really get to make it yours. Think about bringing in items that make you smile or that just remind you why you love sewing. So maybe it's a quilt that you made that you're particularly proud of, or maybe it's a framed vintage sewing pattern that really speaks to your style. I personally keep a few small little ceramics on my desk that came from local artists, and they really inspire me and just make me happy every time I look at them. And you can also keep your tools in them, keep things in them. Plants can add life to your sewing space, artwork, or you can put up meaningful quotes that really can keep you motivated. For me, the key is to kind of change up these items seasonally a little bit, or whenever inspiration strikes. I really like to keep my space feeling fresh and joyful. One of the ways I do that is to bring in some fresh flowers once in a while, just from my garden, or even foliage from outside, a few branches from outside. It makes the place feel more kind of fresh and alive, but it also allows me to change things up with the seasons and really make it feel like a place that's dynamic. There's also things you can do for the holidays. So during the holiday season, I'll hang up a few little ornaments here and there, just things to kind of make it feel special and make it feel like a place that you want to be in and a place that is celebratory for you, because it really is a place to celebrate your own creativity and the time that you're dedicating for yourself. Now for tip 4, creating a space within your space. I love this one. So if you can carve out even a tiny corner for a comfy chair, you're kind of creating a little area for a mini retreat where you can take breaks, you can flip through pattern books, or you can just sit and plan your next project. So I keep a small side table next to mine for my ever-present cup of tea and whatever sewing book I'm currently obsessing over. I can keep those there. And this is where you can really let yourself relax and just get inspired. I think having a dedicated spot for breaks actually helps you to stay more focused when you're working, and it makes your sewing time just that much more enjoyable. I really like having this as a dedicated space within the space. It really just brings in that feeling of relaxation and that feeling of joy that I want to experience in my sewing space. I think sometimes it's really easy to get focused on the creation process, the implementation process, the building process, the process of actually doing the sewing. But a lot of the fun is actually in the dreaming and the scheming and the planning. So having a little area just to do that can kind of encourage that and remind you of those other parts of sewing that are just as inspiring and just as fun. For tip 5, let's get practical and talk about multifunctional furniture. So this is especially crucial if you're working with limited space. A foldable cutting table can be a real lifesaver if you don't have a lot of space. I have one myself, which you can see in the sewing shed tour that I mentioned before on the YouTube channel. But even before I had this one I have is a koala cabinet. It's really, really nice. It's got drawers. It folds up pretty big. But before that, I had one from IKEA that folded up really, really small. It had leaves on both sides. It was meant as like a apartment kitchen table for like a small apartment. And it worked really well for a number of years. So if you can find something like that, it can be really, really helpful if you have a small space. Storage ottomans are another favorite of mine because they can hold supplies while also doubling as extra seating when a friend comes to visit. And you can also look for desks with built-in storage to maximize your space efficiency. So the goal here is to make your room adaptable while keeping everything organized and accessible. And that will just encourage you to sew more because things will feel more calm and less chaotic. Tip 6 is to focus on creating work zones. And this is all about creating a seamless workflow for yourself. So think about your sewing process. Where do you cut? Where do you press? Where do you sew? So even in a small space, you can create dedicated zones using portable or foldable surfaces. Some people use rolling carts to keep their tools organized as they move between different areas. And also stackable trays can be really helpful for keeping your supplies organized and mobile. So one thing I use a lot are caddies and baskets that can move around with me. So when you set up your sewing space this way, you'll spend a lot less time moving things around and more time actually sewing. You don't have to spend so much time looking for your tools. You have them all together, you have them all organized, and you can carry them with you no matter where you go. I also find that one of the advantages of having, for example, caddies or trays or a rolling carts, anything like that, sewing tools are often kind of small. So it's very easy for them to get lost, especially if things are a little bit chaotic. You've got your project all over the place, fabric all over the place. It's very easy to lose, for example, your thread snips, and then you're spending all this time looking for them. Are they under your fabric? Where are they? But if you have a little caddy and you just put everything, you get into the physical habit of putting it back every time you use it, you always know where it is. And it's much easier to spot a large caddy in your space than it is a tiny little sewing tool. So that's been very, very helpful for me. For tip 7, let's talk about creating an inspiration wall or a mood board. I love doing this. You guys know, if you've seen that video I mentioned of my sewing shed, that I have an inspiration wall in my sewing shed. Again, I'll link to the video tour below if you want to see how I've set it up. But if you have wall space, a large corkboard or a framed wire grid is really perfect for pinning things like fabric swatches or sketches or project ideas. But even if you don't have wall space, you can create a portable mood board in a binder or even a journal. One of our CMRC ambassadors, Carrie, has this wonderful system where she rotates pattern flats on her board every time she finishes a project. And it's such a great visual reminder of her accomplishments and really keeps her motivated for future projects. And finally, tip 8, incorporating personal rituals. This might be my favorite tip because it's about creating those special moments that make your sewing time feel sacred. So if you've been following our podcast for a while, you might have heard Haley and me talk about the importance of sewing rituals. Your space can really support these rituals. So maybe it's brewing a specific type of tea in a mug that coordinates with your room's color scheme, or lighting a candle, or playing your favorite playlist before you start sewing. Whatever it is for you, just creating the rituals that set the mood for you. And then when you're done, Taking a few minutes to tidy up or to journal about your progress can really help create this kind of clear boundary between your sewing time and the rest of your day. And these rituals become even more powerful when they're tied to entering and exiting your sewing space. They signal to your brain that it's time to be creative. So those are the tips that I wanted to share with you today. I'm just going to recap them for you. I shared 8 tips that have personally helped me to create a sewing space that feels more like a sanctuary. Number 1 is to choose soothing colors and decor that create a calming atmosphere while still energizing your creativity. So you can think about peaceful blues and greens, or you can think about pops of bright accents, depending on the energy level you're going for. Number 2 is to prioritize comfort with proper ergonomic seating, cushioned standing mats, and then cozy touches that make long sewing sessions enjoyable and sustainable. Number 3 is to personalize your space with meaningful items like handmade quilts or vintage patterns or local artisan pieces that really just spark joy and inspiration. Number 4 is to carve out a dedicated little mini retreat corner with a comfortable chair for planning and reading and taking mindful breaks from your sewing. Number 5 is to incorporate multifunctional furniture like foldable cutting tables and storage ottomans to really maximize space efficiency while maintaining your organization. Number 6 is to create distinct work zones for cutting, pressing, and sewing to establish a really smooth workflow, even if you have a compact space. Number 7 is to design an inspiration wall or a mood board that showcases your current projects, fabric swatches, and creative ideas to keep the motivation flowing. And number 8 is to establish personal rituals like maybe brewing a special tea or lighting a candle, just to make your sewing time feel sacred and separate from everyday life. So those are my tips for you today. They've really helped me to establish my own sewing space as something special, as a little sanctuary that I can go to. And my big takeaway in looking through all of these tips that I shared today is that it's really all about creating a feeling. It's about creating the feeling that you want to have around sewing. And that can be different depending on who you are and what you're going for with your sewing. Some people want to feel really alive and energized, and they want to have maybe loud music on and have it be a place that they can go to just feel more energized. And other people want a place to just calm down and be serene and take a break from the rest of life. And that part, I think, is really dependent on the individual, but there are certain things that you can do to make sure that you are creating the mood that you want to have. And that's what it all comes down to. And I think sometimes we kind of underestimate how much of an effect our environment has on our mood, but it's something that's totally within our control. We can control a lot of aspects of our environment. So today's tips are really about inviting you to take a little bit more control over that. All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit before we go about our community. We are so lucky to have some of the nicest and most helpful sewists you can imagine in our private community. Our team, along with thousands of seam workers, are here to talk to you and to cheer you on. And you can really ask any question about sewing with absolutely no judgment and get some amazing answers. You can also share your finished projects and create sewing goals, and we'll even email you reminders to keep you on track. It's just the perfect place to go if you need a boost of creative energy. So if you'd like to join us, you can, and you'll get a 50% off discount when you join us through our special link for our podcast listeners at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And if you like this episode, please leave us a review. You can also follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become part of our private community, like I mentioned, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, our podcast listeners get a 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And that does it for us this week. I am Sari, and this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.